change a little bit what I want to say, because I was very moved by some of what Kate said before me, by her expression of her sense of tenderness for this country, which, if you've read Romulus, My Father, you'll know I feel especially about this region. I'm not religious either, but I think the word soul is a very good word if you think not of its metaphysical or necessarily religious connotations, but just as it's more commonly used in expressions like soul-destroying work or soul music, for example, or Simone Weil, a woman I greatly admired, once said that the Greeks used to say that a person loses half his soul the day he becomes a slave. Some people prefer the word psyche, but you wouldn't want to say psyche destroying work or psyche music, or a man loses half his psyche the day he becomes a slave. So this is a perfectly good word that captures a lot, and one needn't feel one is dispossessed of it because one's not religious. The other way, respect in which I've changed things is, in fact, because of some of what Kate said about the dispossession of the indigenous peoples of this land, and in this case the Dja Warren, who were dispossessed and whose dispossession has not, in my judgment, been adequately recognised in forms of political association in this country, not just them, but in the case of all the indigenous peoples. And I notice that many young indigenous peoples are now again trying to speak about forms of self-determination or treaty. These are necessarily vague concepts, or so it seems to me, vague concepts whenever I hear them expressed. But what they're gesturing towards is that the indigenous peoples have a form of political association in this country which adequately reflects the fact that they were dispossessed, and that is still yet to come. I'm sure a lot of you know the wonderful writer Alex Miller, who is also a kind of local, and may have read his book, The Stone Country, Journey to the Stone Country, in which there's a character called Dugald. Well, Dugald was in fact based upon a real character, Frank Bunby, who died just recently, a wonderful man. But in response to someone talking about the dispossession and the struggle against it, Frank said, "It ain't over yet, mate." And I hope he's right. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I think to be the deepest concept of justice that we have, and I want to do it by talking about two examples. And the first of them I didn't have in mind to talk about until this morning after Kate's talk, and it's connected with the Mabo judgment. As everybody knows, that judgment overthrew the doctrine of terra nullius, which, as far as I understand it, meant that the land was for legal purposes empty. And a lot of people think, and this is partly true of course, that that concept was theorised according to Locke's theory of property. But I've argued in other places that its application depended on a kind of racist denigration of the indigenous peoples, an incapacity really to see that their relations to the land could have any depth, and therefore that they could in any ordinary sense be seriously wronged if moved off their land. I put it moved off because it's as though they thought the concept of dispossession with all its moral resonances didn't apply either. And I want to say a little bit about what I think racism to be, or that kind of racism to be, because racism is in fact a very complex phenomenon, and it's not just one thing. And to do that, I'll tell you a little story. It's a true story. Many years ago, a woman came to visit us in London, and she had been to Scotland where her son had died. He fell off a cliff, and she was staying with us waiting for the post-mortem report. And one day she was sitting in the living room watching television, where she saw on the screen Vietnamese mothers grieving and wailing indeed over their dead children who'd been killed in American bombing raids. And she sat there and moved towards the screen as though, as though expressing a sense that she and these women shared a common suffering. And then she sat back and said, "Oh, it's different for them, they can just have more." Now, what was, I mean, those words by themselves won't tell us exactly what she meant. She certainly didn't mean that she was sterile, no, they weren't. But very importantly, nor did she mean that they had suffered such brutality through wars of first with the French and then with the Americans and so on. They had had such brutalised lives that they had themselves become brutalised and couldn't anymore fully understand what it meant to have and to lose a child. That could happen to people, but she didn't mean that. Hers was a racist remark, not an empirical generalisation. If she'd meant the former, they become so brutalised, etc., that life has become cheap for them and so on, she would have admitted, could have admitted under pressure, well, some do, some don't. And of course she would also have thought that maybe when life returns to normal for these people, then they'll be like us, because she implied, of course, I can't just have more, that was implicit. As a racist remark, it wasn't a kind of empirical generalisation. She wasn't vulnerable to someone saying, "Oh, look, there are some, don't be so hasty." This was a kind of perception, not about some fact about them, but a perception of what things could mean for them, or more accurately, how things couldn't mean for them. We grieve over our children, we, the racist we here. We grieve over our children. It can lacerate our souls for the rest of our lives. But they can't. They don't. Not just don't, can't. She found it unintelligible that they could. And what I mean by unintelligible here, you might get the hang of it if you think, remember for many of you, the black and white minstrel face show, which was, they were a song and dance act and comedians on American television, white people, they blackened their faces, big white around their eyes, big white around their mouths. And it was absolutely clear that a face that looked like that to you, if you felt that such a face was in fact a just caricature of an Afro-American face, then you couldn't see dignity or depth in such a face. As I've sometimes written, you couldn't cast such a face that looked like that to you to play Othello, for example, because it was impossible of the full range of expression. You couldn't see dignity in a face like that. So that's, I think, an important aspect of racism. We often think racism is just a set of false empirical beliefs, psychologically motivated for one reason or another, of the kind that racism in fact expressed in their stereotypes. But mostly those, at least in this case, that's not the most important thing that's going on. And exactly the same comment, more or less with the same meaning, was in fact made by one of the protector of the Aborigines in Western Australia, James Isdell, when he was asked what did it feel like to take mothers from their children from their grieving mothers. And he said, well, it's not too bad, it's okay, because though they grieve and they scream, they soon forget their offspring. It was exactly a remark of the same kind. Now, one of the things I want to bring out about this kind of racism is that you might think that what it means is that someone like this woman whose son had died, or someone like Isdell, thinks that natives, primitive peoples, whatever, are somehow irredeemably shallow. But that's not the deepest lesson here. The deepest lesson is that someone like that woman I was describing, or Isdell, they think that the victims of their denigration, in the one case Aborigines, in the other case Vietnamese, don't exist in the conceptual space in which concepts like depth and shallowness have application. If a white woman that this woman knew did have a child, as though, in 2 months or 3 months, she'd upbraid her and say, for God's sake, don't you know what it means to have a child? What on earth are you doing? You're having a child like you might get a new pup. But she wouldn't dream of doing that to the Vietnamese women, because she would know believe that there's no point in calling them to that kind of seriousness. They couldn't possibly understand such a conversation. She could never imagine herself in serious conversation with such people, not just about having children, because once you see this as a racist remark, it applies to everything in their lives, their sexuality, their sense of their mortality, everything. And as soon as you know that, you know too that she believes they can't be wronged like we can be. They could be wronged, she thinks. There's such a thing as being cruel to them, but it's not like being cruel to one of us. We have absolutely clear examples of this kind of thing. For example, in the practices in the southern states of America, when slavery was a practice, there were people who were described as compassionate slave owners in the sense that they would berate their slave-owning neighbour for raping a slave girl, say you shouldn't do that, while at the same time not dreaming for a moment that slavery itself constituted an injustice. And the same point can be made about the many complex intentions during the taking of the children's programs. That people had compassion sometimes for the children, but always it was a compassion directed to a racially denigrated people and was deeply condescending for that reason. So I've come to see Mabo as an act of justice. I mean, I think it's natural to think of it as an act of justice, which was nothing less than the recognition of the full humanity of the indigenous peoples. People who see indigenous peoples, or Vietnamese and so on, as this woman saw them. In my writings I've called her M, or as Isdell saw the indigenous peoples. It's most natural to say, it's a perfectly good application of English expression to say they don't see them as fully human. If you think that they can't grieve like we do, they can't love like we do. And therefore I came to think of Mabo as the recognition of the full humanity of the indigenous peoples. And in that case, in that aspect, an act of justice far deeper than anything that can normally be characterized as a desire to ensure that people have equal access to goods and opportunities. It would trivialize the idea of recognizing someone as fully human, to say, now you have access to all the good things that everybody else has access to, the material possessions and so on. So that's one example, and I'm going to now give another example which in a way illustrates the same point, and it's an example that's had an enormous impact on my work, thinking about it, that is to say. And it was given in a book by Hannah Arendt, which is called Eichmann in Jerusalem, and it's subtitled The Banality of Evil, Reflections on the Banality of Evil, something like that. And she reported on the Eichmann trial, Eichmann being, as of course you know, one of the chief architects of the final solution. And he was kidnapped by the Israelis from Argentina, taken to Jerusalem where he was tried. And for very understandable reasons, the Israelis wanted to make a show trial of this to teach the world a lesson about the Holocaust and about many other things. And because of that perfectly understandable desire, the trial threatened at certain points to degenerate into a farce. And the presiding judge, a man called Landau, Moshe Landau, he was moved at one time to say, this trial has one purpose, and it has one purpose only, and that is to do justice. Now, I think he meant, that had many layers of meaning. It meant, of course, that we have to do justice to Eichmann's victims. And it meant we have now to follow due procedure and not let the whole thing deteriorate into a shambles. But he also meant, and I know he meant this because he said more or less as much in interviews. It had to do justice to Eichmann, for Eichmann's sake, as a human being. And the thought was not, I stress, that he had to protect proper procedure in the course because of various kinds of considerations that have to do with slippery slopes you might be on to. Let it go here, God knows what happens afterwards. No doubt that was in consideration too. The integrity of the court had to be protected. But it was intrinsic, or was fundamental to Landau's conception of protecting the integrity of the court. That the court do justice to Eichmann for Eichmann's sake. Now, I think this is an utterly sublime feature of law. It's something sublime, and sometimes I'm inclined to put the point, and it shows itself in something as banal as law. But I don't want to say that. Well, I don't mean it actually. I have a part-time appointment in a law school, not that I could teach a first-year course in law, but I gave them seminars to the postgrads, and I was really astonished by how cynical they all are. You know, they look at me and they say, "You mean you believe in the dignity of law?" And I say, "Yeah, I do, actually." So this, in fact, would be an example of it, just as Mabo is an example of it. Mabo was the first judgment I ever read in law, and I tell you, I was so impressed by it. And I thought, God, if only our political discussion could rise to something like this. Anyway, I won't elaborate on that. But the reason I call it sublime is because it seems to me the most natural thought in the world is to say, look, if you want to be treated like a human being, or expect to be treated like a human being, then you first behave like one. And it's natural to think that some people do some things that are so terrible that they put them beyond the pale of just treatment. And of course, then we'll be careful because we think we're frightened that if we do that in our institutions, we'll be on a slippery slope. But we won't think that justice is owed to that person. We'll think justice is owed to most people in the community, and we better protect the institutions of justice from their degradation. But what was so wonderful about this simple expression that this court has one purpose and one purpose only, is to have recognised that even an evildoer, and it's hard to imagine worse evils. In fact, there are people who say, I don't have much time for the concept of evil, but the Holocaust might be an exception. And as I say, such a sublime thing, but it did show itself. If you ask, how does it express itself? It expresses itself in something very simple. Following court procedures. It was as simple as that. You know, it didn't have to be anything dramatic. In fact, to be dramatic would have contradicted what he was trying to do. We just now quietly follow the procedures of the court, even in a case like this. Now, Landau was someone who had been trained in the Germanic tradition of jurisprudence, and that's been greatly influenced by the philosopher Kant. And from Kant we have the expression, this, or at least in its contemporary sort of usages, we have the expression that inalienable dignity, the idea that every person possesses an inalienable dignity to which is owed not esteem, but a respect that is unconditional. And that's how Landau would have expressed it, that even Eichmann has an inalienable dignity to which is owed respect, and the way in which that respect is showed is in proper court procedures. And this is a concept that you'll find now in preambles to international law. It's there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's there in the Convention Against Torture and in various other instruments of international law, which seem to suggest, in these preambles, where people talk about sometimes the dignity of the person, or the dignity of man, or the inalienable dignity, those preambles seem to suggest that the violation of those laws, the ethical elaboration of what it means to violate those laws, what it means to torture someone, for example, will be captured by elaboration on what it means to possess inalienable dignity and what it means for that dignity, that kind of dignity, to be owed an unconditional respect. So that's the, I think this, by the way, we're losing this idea quite rapidly for a number of reasons. One is, I think, because it's philosophical spelling sounds, either in Catholic natural law tradition or in the Kantian tradition just won't work, and but also for other kinds of reasons, I think. And I think, going back to Kate's talk, I think one of the things I fear most about climate change in the relatively short term, which I mean, let's say the next 50 years or so, is that the effects of climate change, and especially on poorer countries, will be so drastic, and crop failures, changes of governments, more authoritarian and brutal regimes, more crimes against humanity being committed. And in countries like ours, as the penny drops on politicians, that things really are serious, but maybe they'll think now it's a bit too late, a deeper disposition to authoritarianism that already exists in these governments. Then I think we'll be in desperate need of such a concept, and I fear we may not have it anymore. There's such a thing as conceptual loss. We lose concepts. We lose the language in which to express things. We become awkward in it. Well, Hannah Arendt, I'll just now I don't know if I can say briefly what I want to say now, but Hannah Arendt, who wrote this book, subtitled it The Banality of Evil. And some people think of evil as just meaning something like, God, that was really morally terrible. And that's a natural way to think. But there's also some people, I think, and traditionally there has been a thought, that evil marks out, the concept of evil marks out something quite distinctive in our moral concepts. And interestingly, there's been a traditional association of evil and good. Good and evil is a phrase, which of course has been much degenerated when people like George Bush use these sorts of expressions, and we tend to think when people talk about good and evil, they oversimplify things, they want to demonize people, and so on. And people sometimes do, perhaps often, I don't know. When they speak of good and evil, want to do this, oversimplify things, black hats, white hats, etc., and all that sort of thing. I think there is such a thing as wondrous goodness, which shows itself sometimes in the way in which, in fact, in a tradition of saintly love, actually, for people who suffer the most severe and ineradicable affliction, and who have sometimes been shown in saintly deeds a kind of compassion which has not a trace of condescension in it, which is a kind of goodness to wonder at, because we suddenly see people who are radically degraded, from whom we want to turn away, in whom it is hard to see anymore a full humanity. We recognise in the light of some of those wondrous deeds their full humanity. Have I got 10 minutes?
Yes.
I'll give you a story which I've written about, but which is not a religious one, which I think makes this point wondrously, and it comes from Primo Levi, his book, If This Is a Man. And Levi is, and a friend, his name is Charles, are in a barrack and they can already hear in Auschwitz, and they can already hear the Russian artillery coming, so they have reason to hope that they might be liberated in, who knows, 1, 2, 3 weeks. And there's typhus in this hut. And there's a young man, Lutmacher, in the hut, and he has dysentery, and he falls off his bunk and lands on the ground, and there he is in his vomit and his feces, groaning. And Levy describes how his friend Charles gets out of his bunk and tries to get some straw from Lutmacher's mattress to clean him up as best he can, and to comfort him to some degree, and then to try to get him up onto his bed again. And Levy says about this, he says, Charles did this with the tenderness of a mother. Now, this is for me the most extraordinary thing about that episode. It was, of course, an extraordinary thing to risk your life for someone who was bound to die after years in Auschwitz, knowing probably you might be free if you survive the typhus in a few weeks. And people often call that a supererogatory act, an act above and beyond the call of duty. And it's very impressive. It's a kind of feat of heroism. But what's striking about this is not so much that as the fact that he could respond to this utterly degraded person with that tenderness and thereby reveal, in the way that merely performing a supererogatory act would not reveal, that even this wretched human being was still infinitely precious, because that's what's revealed in the tenderness, in the way it wouldn't have been if Charles had acted on an imperative obligation and said, this is what I must do. Right? That wouldn't have shown. It would have been impressive. I don't want to denigrate that, the supererogatory fact. What I want to do, in fact, is say how marvellous that is, but to suggest there's a marvel and a wonder of a different order in the fact that he could respond. And one of the big differences is that if it were merely a supererogatory act, we would be constantly focusing our attention on Charles and what a marvellous person he was, etc. But through this, he's doing the tenderness of mother, the focus is on Lutmacher. And a kind of wonder that even in these circumstances, in some mysterious way, a person retains fully their humanity. But we need deeds of these kinds to reveal that to us. Why do I say that? Because I think that's the concept of good that goes with a concept of evil. I think of evil as the destruction, the violation of the preciousness of every human being that is revealed in deeds like those of Lutmacher, and have been revealed historically in our tradition, in other saintly deeds. I call them saintly because of that quality, not necessarily that they're being committed by people who have been named saints or who are religious and so on. So I think not every tradition has that concept of the inalienable preciousness of every human being. And if they don't have it, they don't have that concept of goodness and that concept of evil. So I think we ought to reserve evil for that, not treat it as just a kind of expletive where we say, God, that was really a shithouse thing to do, or something like that. And then it will have an important place in our range of moral concepts. Arendt, in that book, talked about the banality of evil. She spoke rather inconsistently about this. At one stage, when this offended people, because it makes it sound like a merely an ascetic category, she said, look, she was just making an observation on Eichmann, a particular observation on this man, that he wasn't Iago, he wasn't so, he was just a banal bureaucrat who did the most evil things, but through the most banal sorts of motives. I think she's right about Eichmann, but she certainly would be wrong in generalising that. Ivan the Terrible wasn't like that at all, and there are lots of people who are not like that. There are some people, this is very important, I think, there are some people such that when you look at them who've done the most terrible deeds and whose characters seem fully to match those deeds, you have no trouble in one way understanding where those deeds came from. They're utterly unrepentant, and you can't see in them some place where repentance would grow. It's a big mistake, I think, to say there's some good in everyone, if that is meant to suggest there is now something, if only we could see it. It's hard to see, but there's now something, from which such a repentance could grow. I think A, that's a mistake. I think B, is a very dangerous mistake, because when, after time, we fail to see it, we'll think such a person can be eliminated like a stray dog. Landau wasn't saying there's something in this man I can see from which a repentance would grow. But equally, this is the point, one would never say of any human being that that is impossible, which is different. And you say that against the odds. No, it's not against the odds, because it's not an empirical point. You say that as a kind of act of faith, that you will never say of any human being that they are now to be cast out because there is nothing in them that it has any good in them. So when people say things like we should never look upon people as monsters, I want to say, well, yes and no. There are some people who are monsters in this very ordinary sense, that they have the most terrible characters. They're fully vicious. They've done the most terrible deeds. That's the yes part. The no part is that they are owed what Landau would have called, in the case of Eichmann, an unconditional respect. And justice is always owed to them as a form of unconditional respect. And we must never think that they could be cast out and no longer be one of us. One of us just meaning now someone who has inalienable dignity and must never be cast out. That's all it means. So summing up just this little section, I think there is such a thing as evil. That is, I think we have a place for this as a distinctive concept amongst our moral concepts. It doesn't just mean this was morally horrible. I think there are people who have morally horrible characters. I don't think they're evil people. Let me try very quickly to explain what I mean by that. For 5 minutes, yeah, I can do it. For a person actually to be evil, in my view, as opposed to be vicious and cruel and sadistic, which we know people are, can be, they would have intentionally they would have to have fully before them, fully understand that their victim is someone inalienably precious, and intend fully to violate that preciousness, knowing that's what they're doing and wishing to do it. I don't believe that's even intelligible. Right? But even if it is intelligible, hardly anybody is like that. People do evil deeds for very ordinary banal motives. Sometimes they'll do something evil just out of a blind rage. Sometimes they'll do it because they are sadistic or whatever. But to violate the preciousness of a human being, because that is what you intend to do, fully knowing it, I don't believe is possible. So, for that reason, and this is also very important, I don't think evil functions as the concept of evil functions as an explanation of evil deeds. People often resort to it. They say, oh, we're fed up with all the psychiatry and all this stuff. They did it because they're evil. That's the explanation. Now, the idea I'm fed up with all this psychological excusing, etc., etc. If that's meant to be, look, they're moral explanations as to why people do morally terrible deeds. I agree with that. They are moral. Some people are sadistic. They're cruel. Sometimes they're cowards, all sorts of things. Moral concepts are properly invoked in the explanation of why people do things. But the concept of evil, I think, is not to be evoked in the explanation of why people do things. So I think I perhaps should stop there.